How many steps does it take to change a light bulb? I'm not going to make any jokes right now because this is really about the pivot foot. Welcome back to our part 2 of our traveling series. This is part 2 of a 5-part series where we're going to break down each and every little element of traveling violation. Now, this time we're going to talk about common occurrences, or really kind of what happens normally when a player establishes control of the basketball or when a player is getting ready to shoot the basketball. This gets a little bit more into the heart of the rule and kind of what we need to know so that we can call this rule properly. As I've said before, traveling, I believe, is one of the most difficult rules and the rules that we call very inconsistently in the game of basketball at all levels. I'm going to deal with some things with National Federation and NCAA men's primarily, but we'll touch on some other things as necessary throughout this series. Now, the first part that I want to cover, I want to make sure that I cover how do we really establish a pivot foot. Establishing a pivot foot is actually very important in the game of basketball, so in order for us to identify whether we have a traveling violation. In the first part of the series, I dealt with some mythologies. So I want to reiterate in this part that it is really only about the pivot foot. So let's get into some examples of how you establish a pivot foot. Before we get into the topic, subscribe, like, and hit the bell. Now, the first common occurrence that could take place, and the easiest one to identify when we've established a pivot foot, if a player catches or possesses the ball with both feet on the floor, the foot that is lifted is not the pivot foot. The foot that is still on the floor is the pivot foot. This is one of the easiest ways to determine when we have a pivot foot established and when we have the other foot that has been established. So just keep it simple. Both feet are on the floor, no pivot feet. The first foot lifted, the one left on the floor is the pivot foot. If a player catches or possesses the ball, consequently, with both feet off the floor, when the first foot comes down to the floor and then the other foot comes down, the pivot foot, or pivot feet, in this case, pivot foot, is the first foot that comes to the floor. So if I catch the ball in the air and my left foot comes down, then my right foot comes down. My left foot, in this case, is the pivot foot. Now, this is the one that's probably the most difficult to determine, is when a player catches the ball while moving or has stopped the dribble. If it can be determined that one foot is on the floor in that case, the other foot that is not on the floor is the non-pivot foot. The foot that is on the floor during the stopping or catching the ball is the pivot foot in this particular case. Again, this is the hardest way really to determine whether we have a travel violation or not, because identifying the pivot foot is paramount to calling this properly. Now, in the case of when you have established that pivot foot while moving, you can lift that pivot foot to pass and shoot. So let me go back to my example. If I catch the ball or I stop my dribble with my left foot on the floor, that is my pivot foot if the right foot is in the air. I can lift my left foot to shoot or pass. If I put that foot back down to the floor, I have committed a traveling violation. Again, this is why we say there's nothing about steps. It's all about the pivot foot. Now let's show an example of a jump stop after a player has stopped their dribble. Let's break this down. Now, if a player catches the ball while dribbling and moving, and they have one foot on the floor, this is a little different part of the rule. That player may land simultaneously, jump off that foot, land simultaneously with my feet, then neither foot in this case is considered the pivot foot in this case. Now, this is affectionately called a jump stop. Now, if you have done this, that means since neither foot is the pivot foot, you may lift either foot, but once you put them back down, you have committed a traveling violation. And again, this is affectionately called a jump stop, but jump stop is not stated clearly in the rule book as a jump stop. It is stated of what can be done by rule. Now, if both feet are off the floor when catching or your dribbling stops, a player may land simultaneously on both foot. Then that means either foot can be the pivot foot. So if I land simultaneously and I decide I want to lift my left foot in the air, then my right foot has been established as the pivot foot. If I do the same thing in another move, catch or stop my dribble with both feet on the floor, and I land simultaneously, and I decide to lift my right foot, I can lift my right foot. My left foot is the pivot foot in this particular case, okay? So this gives a provision of movement with the ball in this case where either foot you can kind of choose. And again, we need to identify which one is the pivot foot. Let's start with the very first video of an example of establishing a pivot foot while moving. I want to kind of explain why this is not a travel and why we should not be so ultra technical when we call travels. So here's the example.
Coming up with a loose ball, throws a perfect pass down to his teammate Ducky Stewart, goes strong to the basket.
We must have obvious possession on this play. So the obvious possession is not gained until the right foot is down on the floor. Yes, the player probably touches the ball with his left foot on the floor, but touching can actually precede possession. So in this play, philosophy-wise, consider the right foot to be where possession is. Or he has possession in the air, then comes down on his right foot. We are not trying to nitpick this. Make sure that we have this a solid call and this is something we can defend without video. As you can see, if you can identify the pivot foot will tell you whether they have done something legal or illegal. Now that I've broken down the pivot foot examples of how traveling takes place or traveling doesn't take place, let's get into a few examples where traveling doesn't involve a pivot foot at all. Let me show these to you. A player standing with possession of the ball. Again, they are holding the ball while standing. A player may not touch the floor with anything other than their foot or their hand. So if their forearm, elbow, side, knee all come to the floor, this would be considered a traveling violation under our rules. Again, if I'm holding the ball, I have possession, and I maintain possession when my knee, my forearm, my elbow hits the floor, it is a traveling violation at that moment. Now, if I've gained possession while on the floor, so the ball's come to me, I've grabbed the ball while on the floor, I cannot get up or make an attempt to get up. Now, that is within some kind of explaining I need to do. So, if I'm on my back, I can't move to my side. If I'm on my stomach, I can't come to my knees. If I am on my back, I actually can sit up. There's nothing against the rules that says I can't sit up, but I can't make an attempt to raise with my hand or anything to get up off the floor in any way, shape, or form. If I do, I've committed a traveling violation. This is a common occurrence, and probably the most common travel that we probably never call accurately or we don't call consistently. When the pivot foot is established, again, whatever foot that may be, so let's say in the case my left foot, I cannot lift my left foot before I start a dribble. Now, what does it mean before I start a dribble? The ball must have released in my hand and going to the floor, not hit the floor, just released before I lift my pivot foot at all. It doesn't have to be put back down, just simply lifted in order to start a dribble. This is a traveling violation. And really, this is a basic fundamental. This is in the rules. This is actually under National Federation rules. This is a rules fundamental. A player can never, ever, and I hate to say never, and I sometimes hate to say always, you can never travel while in an active dribble. So anytime you are dribbling the ball, you can dribble. It is impossible by rule because you haven't had a pivot foot. You haven't established a pivot foot. You are still dribbling. You're allowed to move with your body. And even consequently in the previous example that I gave, I can get up off the floor by dribbling. So if I'm on the floor, I can dribble and then I can stand up if a player or my opponents allow me to do so. Now let me show you an example of a player coming up off the floor. I want you to think in your mind, based on what I had covered in the rule, how this applies to our code. Does the player pick this ball up or does the player use the ball to get up off the floor? And does it really matter anyway? Tell me what you think or think in your mind when you see this video.
Rondo on his knees pulls it away from Jason Williams and scores off the window. Two-man win for...
Does the player pick the ball up and get up off the floor, or does he use the ball or lift off of the ball in order to gain possession or to get possession before he gets up off the floor? That is what you have to decide. I think that this is not a traveling violation in any code. Now that we've gotten through all the examples, I hope this helps you better understand at least how we establish a pivot foot, when we may have a traveling violation, with or without the pivot foot, and made you think about a couple things on how we may philosophy-wise call this violation. Thank you very much for watching the video to the very end. Again, this was part 2 of a 5-part series. There will definitely be more to come. Thank you and have a good day.